good afternoon and welcome to Scythe Academy's literature Webline literature series, and today's program is in English. Before going into today's program, I request all the viewers on YouTube and Facebook, please leave your comments with some kind of a marker, either your email ID or Twitter handle or Facebook profile link, so that we can collect your comments and circulate it among the panelists today for their answers. It's good to see many of you are discussing in the social media and different platforms among yourselves. Yeah, that's wonderful thing to see. People are discussing literature, but unless you leave your comments, whatever you want to say, your queries, either in the YouTube comments column or in the Facebook the comments column, it's very difficult for us to rummage through the entire social media, all these things together, and then collect everything. It's very difficult for us. So please, my sincere request to all of you once again is, please do leave your comments so that the panelists today can get back to you with their response. Now, having said that, today's program is on how Anglicized is Bhasha literatures. There is influence and impact of English on Indian literatures, various literatures of India. To discuss this, we have a very distinguished panel, and the first panelist of today is Professor E.V. Ramakrishnan. He's a bilingual critic, poet, and translator with 15 books in English and 7 books in Malayalam. To his credit, he has received the Kerala Sahitya Academy Award and Moderator Award for Literary Criticism in Malayalam. He retired as a professor and dean from the Central University of Gujarat. Sir, welcome to the show, Professor E.V. Ramakrishnan.
Yes. Yeah.
And our second panelist is Professor Jatindra Kumar Nayak. He is an author, translator, critic, scholar, and academician. He was a former professor of English at Utkal University, and he is a winner of Hutch Crossword Book Award in 2004. At present, he is a member of English Advisory Board of Sahitya Academy. And it's good to have you, Professor Nayak. Thank you. And our next panelist is Professor Anisur Rahman, critic, translator, and poet. Dr. Anisur Rahman worked as a professor of English at Jamia Millia. He is currently senior advisor at Rekta Foundation, and he has worked and published extensively in the areas of post-colonial literature, translation, and comparative studies. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. So, Professor Evia, we'll start with you. It's inevitable. It is inevitable that influence of other languages on many other languages, one language on many other languages, especially if the language is a very dominant one, especially across the globe, not only in India. So given that we have extreme perceptions, one is that of people who say that this is not good. Well, it will ultimately lead to some kind of a degeneration in the literature in Indian languages. The English should become more popular, and the other spectrum is it is good. That means the language is accepting various sounds from not only within the country but also from across the world. That means that the language and literature is alive and kicking. So how do we reconcile these two perceptions, Professor Evia?
Yeah, thank you for it. It's a very important question, cultural, social, political. I would argue that India is a multilingual country, and our languages have flourished in the context of multilingual, multicultural traditions. And when English appeared on the horizon in the 19th century, Indian languages initially responded to the challenge of what you call the colonial imperial kind of, you may say, onslaught, cultural onslaught, through translations, through a number of cultural engagements. Every Indian language has been able to confront the foreign influence through a process which is in keeping with the genius of that language, in keeping with the cultural capital of that language. So I would not argue that Anglicization or the onslaught of English in any way has endangered Indian languages. Let me give 2 or 3 examples. In the first half of 19th century, a language like Malayalam comes into its own through the printing press, a number of dictionaries, grammars, and in the first half of 19th century, you can already see Malayalam is more or less equipping itself with the discourse of modernity, with the requirements of international kind of cultural production. And in the second half of 19th century, you actually see the confluence of 3 things. One is the emergence of prose. The other is the emergence of the public sphere and the print medium, periodicals. So periodicals, public sphere and prose together create a new sensibility. The novel emerges, the short story, the autobiography. I am sure my co-panelists, who are both my esteemed friends, great scholars, they will have more to add. So Malayalam takes a new direction, takes a leap into what I call the modern phase of its development through this encounter with the West. Definitely there are issues which may be slightly disturbing here, like the Orientalist kind of new discourse, which created a binary between East and West, which created a classical India, which is spiritual, and a Western kind of world, which is modern. So these binaries do, in a way, create problems in understanding our Indian traditions. But we evolved into the 20th century with literary criticism, with new kind of prose-centric forms, whether it is a novel, drama, autobiography, travelogue, or essay, or short story, or biography, or any number of new forms, largely through our encounter with English. So Anglicization per se has not, in a way, prevented Indian languages from realizing its potential. It has actually brought out the inherent strengths of Indian languages. So to argue that Anglicization is a negative kind of influence would not, I think, be valid. If time permits, I will add one more point. If you look at the evolution of Indian languages, they have always used translation as a mode of engagement and negotiation. All of us are translators here. So it is important to actually recognize the role of English in stirring or inspiring the creativity of Indian languages.
Okay. Okay. Professor Nayak, so I mean, you heard what Professor E.V. Ramakrishnan has said, and then, well, it may be true that English did widen our horizon. But it is not, it is not always that one or the other, some dominant language within the subcontinent. We knew that Sanskrit and the later Persian. The amount of Sanskrit words in each Indian language and literature, and later, Persian words, like, for example, many of the Urdu words, which even percolated down to south. So, why is it that we see only English? Of course, colonialism, that the British Empire has a specific historical background to this. But is it the time that we come out of this and create our own vistas?
I agree with most of what Professor E.V. Ramakrishna said about the emergence of a new kind of literature, new kind of modernity out of Malayalam's negotiation with English. The situation in relation to Odisha or Odia language is almost the same, but I would talk about the anxieties which Odia intellectuals or Odia literati experienced in the middle of the 19th century. So in the beginning it was Sanskrit, so it had to negotiate with Sanskrit, and many, particularly the Bhakti, during the Bhakti period, many Sanskrit epics like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata were translated or rewritten in Odia. Then, of course, you have the Indo-Persian heritage, and many, like you said, many words from the Indo-Persian languages, Persian, Arabic, Urdu, entered Odia language. But when English was introduced in 1835 or towards the middle of the 19th century, I think many in Odisha, particularly the Western educated Odia middle class, found its approach to or response to this new language rather ambivalent. It was laced with anxiety.
Mhm.
English was the language of opportunity. So even in newspapers which are published in 1866, you get articles about how English texts were being taught in schools because they were worried about people learning English and getting jobs.
Okay.
And there is a famous poem by Fakir Mohan Senapati, who is a very famous, renowned Odia novelist, the father of Odia fiction. In this poem, he talks about the colonial knowledge system as a marketplace. And he goes there and finds that all the traditional literary forms or the traditional knowledge systems are being displaced by the European or English knowledge system like Shakespeare, Byron, medicine, whatever. I think these were displacing. So initially they experienced a kind of displacement that English, because it was backed by colonial power, was displacing many traditional knowledge systems, and they felt insecure. At the same time, like Professor EVR pointed out so insightfully, they also negotiated with the new language, English. And through translation, they started revitalizing their own language. So Odia began negotiating with, and the emergence of newspapers, emergence of literary magazines toward the end of the 19th century suddenly created opportunities so that Odia language could be revitalized through its contact. The same thing happened when it entered into contact with Sanskrit or Indo-Persian heritage, and then English offered its opportunity, offered it great opportunities for revitalizing itself. So new forms emerged. Literary journalism or literary periodicals came into being, and new forms like the novel, the sonnet, the elegy, the essay, travelogues now began to be written by Odia writers. And Fakir Mohan himself wrote Chaman Artagund, which is a modern classic in 1897. It was published in 1922. So it's a question of a language feeling threatened at the beginning, and then using the resources of the language that seeks to dominate it in order to reinvent itself, regenerate itself. So we can look at it from this point of view. A language constantly tries to renew itself through contact with it, particularly in India, in the multilingual, multicultural situation. Languages have been constantly negotiating with each other and with a dominant language. So the pessimistic view could be that these languages have been dominated by English, but we could also take a more optimistic view of these languages negotiating with a dominant language and reinventing themselves, re-energizing themselves, and creating something new and vitally important.
Okay, re-energizing, revitalizing oneself, and then creating a new vistas. So, Professor Anisur Rahman, you heard what Professor EVR and Professor Nayak had to say, and even not many people see Urdu. I mean, very unfortunately, we have different perceptions. Urdu is a religious literature. No, Urdu is predominantly a secular literature, and also is one of the pan-Indian literature. Pan-Indian, the amount of not many people are focused on the folk literature which is available in Urdu. Not many people have published them actually. I mean, given that it's a wonderful potential it has got, it has not gone into many Indian languages, I mean, of course, English also. So given that, how much do you think that especially at the village levels, where the English words have percolated down to real daily life? So, I mean, how do you think? I mean, does the Urdu literature today, does it reflect this reality?
Thank you, Mr. Rajmohan. Thank you, Mr. Rajmohan and Sahitya Academy for this, for organizing this face-to-face interaction on a very important issue. That is the impact of English on regional languages and literatures. In other words, how anglicized are our literatures? Let me first of all say that, as Professor EVR said about Anglicization, I would personally like to believe, and I do believe in this, that English literature that we teach and that we have been reading in our literature syllabus in the universities is one thing. The way we write our fiction and our poetry is an entirely different kind of a concern. I personally feel that our literatures are not anglicized. That is one major point I would like to make. They are not anglicized. They have grown out of a condition that was very contemporary. When you are writing a particular text in a particular point of time, you write that text, and there are, of course, there are impacts, and these impacts are not very easily, they're very subliminal impacts that you come across. No literature glows unilaterally. Literatures glows multilaterally. And India is a very interesting example in the sense that we are a multilingual country, and we are a multicultural country and multi-ethnic country. And English being in India is because of a historical reason. So it's quite natural that when our poets and fiction writers and other prose, non-fiction prose writers were writing, especially after independence, they had their access to English language and to literature for historical reasons that we know of, that we need not emphasize further. Professor Ramakrishnan spoke with reference to Malayalam, and my friend Jatindra spoke with reference to Odia literature. Let me add to this one point that the question of influence in itself is not a very happy word. In the anxiety of influence, we all know about that. The academics especially know very well about that. One doesn't have to be under influence. One has to get out of the influence to make one's own impact and to create one's own mind and to write about that.
Yeah.
Now, if you think of poetry, for example, I'm talking of two, I'll give you two examples. Poetry in India, Indian English poetry. Now, there were two clear strains, that the poetry before independence and poetry after independence. Poetry before independence was written under the influence, mostly, I'm saying, not 100%, but mostly under the influence of the Romantics. And you have the example of, for example, you have say, poets like Derozio himself, Fakir of Jangira, when he wrote that. Then you have the Dutt family. They were writing under the influence, but influence is not a bad word, as I said, but to speak generally. And most importantly, Sarojini Naidu. When Sarojini Naidu went to England and when she showed some of her poems to English critics and poets there, she was told, write of your own flora and fauna, do not write of the English world, because that is not your world you belong. So try and create a kind of a literature out of the situation in which you live personally. That was a very important message given to her. But you will see the post-independence Indian poetry in English, which begins with some of the very major poets like Nassim Ezekiel, and then you have a whole lot of them coming. Adil Jusrawala is there.
Yeah.
G. Patel, Arun Kolatkar, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, the list is long, coming to Sudeep Sen and others who write today. Now, you will see that there are two kinds of strain. One is this, some of them are academics, so they have very easy access to literature and literary traditions and literary cultures. Then you have another group of poets who are not academics, but they're very well versed in English and other European languages and literatures. Yeah. So it has grown in a very different manner. If you read a poet like Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, you will see the echoes there very clearly. So when the Romantics were influencing the first breed of poets, pre-independence poets, the modernists, starting from W.B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot, they were very greatly influencing the writers who were writing them. Now, coming to Urdu, I'll give you a different kind of example. It also extends to that as well. Say, for example, in Urdu, you have an author like Quratullah and Haider, for example. And
yes, sir.
Quratullah and Haider is there. And then you have Faiz Ahmad Faiz, you have Meera Ji, then you have Noor Meem Rashid. These are three very important poets. Faiz was a progressive poet, you know. And Meera Ji was a very, very modernist poet, wrote differently.
Yeah.
Anim Rashid, Mim Rashid, as it is called in Urdu, didn't subscribe to that. So they were also writing poetry. For example,
Yeah.
French poetry.
Yes, sir.
That Miraji was trying to bring into his poetry and to his writings of criticism on poetry. So, say very interestingly, when the most famous novel, very important novel that Kuratlan Haider wrote, Aag Ka Darya, the river of fire, as you call it in English.
Yeah.
So the first, when you open the page, you will get 4 lines from T.S. Eliot. We will not cease from exploration, and the end of all exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time, which means it's about the cycle of history. So you can trace that impact and you can see that. But time flows here in a different stream altogether. It's a very different kind of a stream that you have. So if you look at it, I will not say it is anglicized. I will say that it has been come closer. They have been able to adopt, we have to adapt, and very clearly make a literature of their own kind of situation in their own language. They have created their own myths, their own imagery. And that is how this Indian literature, though not anglicized, stands on its own feet with great confidence.
Okay. So, Professor Evier is, I mean, like he says, it's not anglicized per se. Indian literature is not anglicized. Maybe if we have to go further in that direction, maybe English helped Indian writing, right? Professor Nayak said from 19th century onwards, it has helped us to create our own versions of new genres. Like, for example, we never had today. In 21st century, we have fantasy literatures in many Indian languages. Yes, we had earlier also, but the content was not categorized as such. In that sense, that yes, in English as a language, and it has helped us
to what Professor Nayak mentioned as the anxiety which Fakir Mohan Senapati had articulated. English also was the language of conquest, as it has been argued. There was an aura about English. It had a certain kind of, because it was also the language of administration, language of power, against which Indian languages did feel a certain lack. They did feel they actually lacked a certain. This was because English was equated with modernity. English actually was equated with modernity, whereas Indian languages came to be a certain kind of, I wouldn't say backward, but definitely, if you look at Grierson's terminology, you do find a lot of Indian languages lacked a certain power to articulate ideas, etc. These were all ideas which circulated within the colonial frame of mind. So definitely this did create a certain rift within the oral and the written forms of. I feel the greatest damage domination did was not to our modern phase, but our understanding of pre-modern phase. Even today, we actually are not able to relate to the rich oral traditions of Indian languages. So you look at the medieval languages, medieval language and literature, even our concept of literary history, which was borrowed from the Western ideas, saw the medieval period as a period of decline, a medieval period as a period of, this is not true of India. India had very rich bhakti traditions. It had forms coming into Indian languages, and almost all major translation of all these were done around
around that time,
the 15th century. Really very assimilative medieval period. So the oral traditions, which even today sustain a certain worldview. If you look at what is characteristically Indian, there was another kind of modernity which is characteristically Indian. Perhaps we actually lost sight of this very complex modernity which was inherent in our own linguality, multicultural inheritance, and the translation, I would say translational inheritance of modern Indian languages by subscribing to a certain norms. The normative was set by the English. I think there we did actually suffer, in the sense new criteria were applied to what is literary, what is literature, what is literary. Written literature is primarily written. Literature is primarily certain kind of forms. I think certain formulations which we actually came to use in the first half of 20th century created a certain kind of actually Ganesh Devi has used the word amnesia. You see, he has used, there is a kind of cultural amnesia.
Yeah.
Definitely there was a certain kind of rift between the kind of modernity Indian traditions actually had and the Western modernity, which became extremely, and maybe it had academic and you see administrative patronage. So definitely that was one reason why the Western became a hegemonic presence in our cultural vocabulary. Maybe that's where I mean, if at all there is a problematic associated with Anglicization, I would actually locate it in equating modernity as the only mode of Western modernity, instead of accepting that there are many modernities and Indian languages were quite capable of in a way imagining Indian versions of modernity.
Okay. So thank you, sir. Now, Professor Nayak, that what taking from what Professor EVR is talking about, and his reference to amnesia as nomenclature given by Dr. Devi. So, but in a very positive sense, even among the most dominant languages, many of the texts were lost, and it is English which helped actually those people from Europe who came here and helped us to unearth and understand, relearn our own past. Is it not? I mean, it is true with many languages also.
I will take the cue from Professor EVR, and I will agree with him when he says that there is this possibility or the reality of alienation.
Yeah.
I think what we consider to be modern literature, particularly modernism in many Indian languages, I'll confine myself to Odia. There was this growing alienation, particularly after independence, that the kind of modern literature that was created under the influence of English literature or European literature quickly grew away from ordinary people. And there is this famous history of Odia literature by Dr. Mayadhar Manse, where he talks about, he comes down very harshly on the modernist poets in Odisha, because he thinks that what they write under the influence of T.S. Eliot or his British exemplars, other British exemplars, has nothing to do with, or very little to do with, life or the lived experience of people. And there I think it's extremely important to recognize the fact that orality was neglected and the oral tradition was completely marginalized, and the written literature, particularly that produced by people who are inspired by English literature or Western literature, got uprooted from our tradition. So this was a huge loss, and this also explains to some extent why modern literature or modernist literature, particularly after independence, lost its reading public. Another famous historian, Krishna Chandra Panigrahi, also talks about the market value, the commercial prospects of modern. Why don't people buy literature written by, or books written by modern poets or modern writers? One of the reasons he suggests is that this growing alienation of so-called Anglicized literature, literature completely modeled on Western literature, the distance it has from, or the way it gets alienated from the lived experience of people, which is deeply rooted in the oral tradition. So musicality is gone, the oral vitality of oral literature is gone. So I think we need to bridge. Somewhere we lost something, and this alienation has to be addressed. And for instance, there is this derivativeness about much of modern criticism, at least that's true of my state, that much of the modern criticism written in Odia is derivative. It full of quotations from English critics, full of quotations from, and this refusal to or reluctance to create our own critical discourse by linking it with our own tradition. So this perhaps is a price we paid for one aspect of Anglicization. There was this creative negotiation which led to the creation or led to the emergence of many important genres. But there is also this negative dimension which made English literature a reference point, dominant reference point, and it took us away from, led us away from the rich oral and musical tradition of our own literature, and perhaps that has resulted in the derivativeness of much modern criticism. So
Okay,
that's my take on the whole.
yeah,
question
thank
of
you.
Anglicization.
Yeah, thank you. Professor Anisur Rahman, that it is this kind of a self-alienation resulting out of this. But at the same time, another point which Professor Jatindra Nayak is referred to, this that quoting pornography, that there is a commercial value or the perception of optic of economics. So, I mean, when, okay, now how do we, as we go along, it becomes, it looks like more and more inevitable to ignore all these things, market sensibilities. How do we reconcile?
Let me respond to the two opinions that have been expressed by
Yes, sir.
Professor Ramakrishnan and Professor Nayak.
Yes, sir.
There are three major issues that have come forward as we discussed.
Yeah.
One was the question of alienation. And the first was, let me say, the first is Anglicization, with which I do not agree. We have not Anglicized our literature. This is number one. Second is alienation. I have great doubts. I would not be able to take this idea very clearly that we have created some kind of an alienation in our literatures. Actually, we are mixing up two things: literature written in English and literature in regional languages. These are two different kinds of literatures. Now, maybe this idea of alienation, that we have gone away from our oral and our literary texts and literary cultures of the past years, and we have gone closer to the US and to the Europe and to the European literature and the American literature and the English literature and all that. And that's why we have forgotten our own. It doesn't seem to be that tenable to me, because maybe in certain regional languages, these things are still there. Like, for example, if you look at the Indian writing in English, the village has disappeared from the Indian fiction. No one asked us not to write about village. We chose to do that. That way, alienation is possible. But then I say that we have created great literature during these 50, 60, 70 years after independence. And this is the literature not of any kind of impact or influence. These are also bad words. As I said in the beginning, these are three important words that we are coming to: alienation, impact, and Anglicization. I would personally believe that our literatures have grown out of a very complex kind of a situation. A linguistic kind of a situation that has been created, or that is very naturally given, I would say. Then the cultural given situations that we live in and we explore and become a part of it day after day. The political situation, the social and the cultural situation. So we place ourselves in that, our protagonists in the fiction and those we talked about in our poetry. For example, if you read a poem like Jejuri, tell me where is the Anglicization? It's a very, very local poem. It's a very, very indigenous poem. It's a very, very poem. Like, for example, if you read a poem by A.K. Ramanujan, A River. Now, a river is a very, very poem rooted in a particular soil. Or if you read a poem by Aga Shahid Ali, it is very, very rooted in soil. There's no question of Anglicization here, and not forgetting the past at all. Well, maybe it's true in the case of the regional literatures, where some of the literatures, I would not like to use the word marginalized, but some of the literatures which are usually said marginalized or marginalized languages, they've been far away from that. But I think there the village lives. You have the village there very much clearly written there. And there you can see how the village vibrates there. So I have problem with these three words: Anglicization. My take is that we are writing literature which is not Anglicized. Had it been so, it would have been sidetracked so far.
Yeah.
And the idea of impact. It's not, we are not writing an impact. We have grown out of impact, and that's why the individual, and that's why Indian literature is being talked about all over. And simply out of this, we can say that it's not a question of alienation. We have not alienated any literature. When the writer writes, he writes sometimes what is there within him, but at times he also writes because of market forces. Yes, quite a bit of our literature is there because of market forces. I made a survey about 10 years ago about the publications during the past 10 years, and I found that in English, three important topics are being discussed again and again, especially in fiction. One is Sufism, there is time, love and lust and crime. Now see, these are being written, and the third is Sufi. Now these are being written because there is a market force behind. Sufi sells, love and sex sells, crime sells, therefore. But also at the same time, there are very important, very powerful literary texts. So we shouldn't be mixing up. Some literature is being written with a purpose. Another literature is written, for example, how do you locate a poem like, or a long poem and a prose piece, a fiction piece, a Golden Gate. Yeah. It doesn't deter you from anything. It was a very revolutionary kind of a text. How do you look at the language that G.V. Desani was writing in the 40s? Then Rajarao, the kind of language he evolved. Yeah. And also he was very well aware of the past traditions of Indian narratology. And then the kind of wit and humor that R.K. Narayan brought in. And after that scenario changes, and when you come to Bednight's Children, he used a word which has been too much publicized, Anglicization, Jatinification of English. So these are the waves and the currents and the intercurrents which go on simultaneously together. And that is how literature goes. So we are growing competitively and we are growing comparatively. And this is the best space. India is the best space, best place, best context where literatures can be studied comparatively. There is no other space, there is no other location in the world where these are multicultural and multilingual and multi-ethnic impacts where literature goes this way. I would personally believe that Indian literature, especially after the 1950s, has taken a different course of modernism and shades of modernism and postmodernism. Alienation, I don't believe it has happened. Maybe it has in the case of regional literatures. My take is that it's very vibrating literature that we are creating. Something which is very, very powerful, which is going to stay on.
Okay, so I mean, basically, Professor I am sorry you lost the internet connection in between. So Professor Anisur Rahman is telling there's no alienation per se as such. And Professor Nayak, you also heard, and Professor Nayak, and we are coming to the end of the program. So one quick thought from all of you, Professor Evia.
Yeah. What Professor Anisur Bhai has actually argued, that also has to be taken into account. In the present context, English has acquired the status of an Indian language. The creativity post 1980, I would actually say, in some sense, Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children was a turning point, and the creativity in English is an essential ingredient of what you call the creativity in Indian languages today. So, but the earlier point we were discussing, that there is a certain kind of power associated with English. So the cultural burden which Indian languages sometimes actually face when they use the oral, and that largely becomes invisible in the context of English. English has a certain aura, English has a certain kind of international or global, in these days, maybe a global kind of presence. So I think one very is an interesting kind of thing that is happening in the recent cultural kind of theory and cultural translation increasingly is looking at marginal tradition. Right. Translation is bringing what actually used to be minor languages or forgotten discourses, or even tribal or lesser languages into the mainstream. And English is playing a very important role in that kind of a context. So I think what is important today is not whether languages of power or languages of less visibility exist. We need dialogues between them. how can literature is basically dialogue. Culture can be sustained only through dialogic kind of exchanges. So Sahitya Academy has always taken this motto forward. So how can we sustain dialogues in Indian languages across the minor and major traditions, across minor and major, what you call, languages, between languages of power and languages of which are lesser kind of. So I think in that kind of a context, maybe translation and a certain kind, English encourages translation, and English also is now largely a language of translation for writers like me who write in Malayalam as well as English. So I think that the role of English may be getting redefined in the context of Indian language. That's what I actually have to say.
Okay. Thank you. Professor Nayak?
Yes,
We go on from you.
I'd like to draw the attention of my distinguished co-participants to an emerging phenomenon. For instance, when we talk about the late 19th century or early 20th century, and our distinguished participants are, both of them are bilingual. They write in their mother tongue and also in English. So in the late 19th century and early 20th century, many writers wrote, they were excellent, they had excellent command of English, and they contributed to their own literature. For instance, we had Radhanath Rai, who read Ovid, who read Shelley, who read many Greek and other writers in English, and then transformed Odia literature by Kriya. And later also many teachers, many writers who actually had degrees in English literature, like Gopinath Mahanti, Dr. Mayadhar Mansingh, many such in the 20th century, they enriched their own language or their own literature by writing, taking the resources of English literature, the English speaking world, and enriching their own world. Increasingly, we see or we come across the phenomenon of lots of young people belonging to the middle class and lower middle classes abandoning their mother tongues, abandoning regional languages, and they're becoming increasingly, depressingly monolingual. So we can't talk about Anglicization. We are talking about the death of many regional languages in schools, colleges, and they're becoming monolingual in English. So this is something that we have to confront. This is far more serious than simple Anglicization. We are no longer negotiating between 2-3 languages. We are becoming dangerously, depressingly, and seriously monolingual. So this is something that I would like us to ponder over seriously.
Okay. So that is mother tongues are being marginalized and seriously we are becoming monolingual. Professor Anisur Rahman, quick thought from you.
Quick thoughts from me. Well, taking the cue from both my friends, I would say that our literatures are essentially assimilative literatures.
Yeah.
If you allow me to use a word which is a very important word to assimilate, better than assimilation, हमारा साहित्य समावेश का साहित्य. I would use the word समावेश. Alienation or marginalization is not something that I would like to subscribe to. I would rather say that we have grown together, we speak together, we think together. Together, I mean, say dialogic mode. In a dialogic mode, we write in a dialogic mode. We presuppose our readers. The reader is different now. The author is a different kind of a creature today. The market is a different kind of a market today. So all these things have the impacts. What do you read? What is your reading choice? Press determines our reading choice a lot. Now, what is Sahitya Academy doing? Sahitya Academy is essentially trying to bring these literatures together to create a condition of Samavesh. So Samavesh is something which our literature is all about. And of course, in a historical process, whenever you look at any literary tradition or any literary history, you will find that there are ups and downs. In English literary history, you have 16th century and 17th century thinking in particular manner. So there is sometimes there is a reason that dominates, sometimes there's emotion that dominates, sometimes there is a assimilation of both. So historical factors are there, especially when you talk of India, which has had a very different kind of history. It was a colony, and after that the post-colonial, and then the post-colonial 70 plus years, and then whatever things have gone post-colonial, I'm using here as with dash, then the without dash post-colonial. So it's a very complex kind of a situation and a very interesting kind of a situation in which you can draw lessons from the kind of writing we are writing, the kind of readers we are producing, as far as the fears and the kind of say apprehension that we have, this is the process of growth. In the process of growth, you always have fears and apprehensions, whether we are losing our track. But look at the vibrancy of the vibrancy of the language, the English language that we write. Parallelly, we can look at the vibrancy that the Urdu, for example, that and Hindi, for example, which I speak and I read and can write it. So look at how vibrant are these languages today and compare it with the language that was being used. How indigenously we are writing and how we are taking also material from the culling from other sources and trying to enrich. So it's a literature of enrichment, of assimilation and samavesh, I would say, and of great, say, we are growing in a very competitive kind of spirit. And the literatures are, say, if you look at the trajectory, you will see that there is very fast movement. If you look at the Indian poetry in English, the trends have changed very frequently. Similarly, if you look at Indian fiction in English, starting from 40s, Desani onwards, you will see that, especially after Rushdie, the change has been very fast. And the literature that is being, especially the fiction that is being produced today, is very different from Rushdie's fiction and from other fictions. So it's a very fast growing kind of an exercise. But at the same time, regional literatures are also growing at the same. I'm not aware of the other literary cultures in other languages, but of course I can think of Indian Urdu where I see it's very vibrant. The language is vibrant, the narrative is very vibrant, and the Scythe Academy is trying to connect all these together so that we learn from each other. And of course, translation. We all agree on this, that translation is a very important platform through which we can revitalize our literature and create our literature.
Ours is a very assimilative cultures and we grow together. So thank you very much, each one of you, for taking time out from your hectic schedule and participate in this series. And the topic today is a very vast one, and maybe we'll have a series of programs in featuring experts from different languages and literatures. And to all the viewers, and please do keep watching our Webline literature series. And we have scheduled standalone lectures and poetry recitation, story readings, full-length webinars, during the course of next 2-3 months, and of course, in all 24 languages. So thank you very much, all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to you, friend. Thanks, Professor Ramakrishnan.
Yeah, thank you, Anisur.
Nayak. Thanks, Rajmohan ji.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.